Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Friday Workplace Virtues program. I'm very pleased to introduce a friend and a colleague, and a partner in uh, Character Act Joint Ventures, Grant Peirce. And Grant Peirce is, I'm going to use a word that not many people hear, a psychometrician. And I'll let him describe what that is. And he's also an industrial psychologist. He's a father, and he is the founder and principal of Peirce Group. And I'll introduce Grant I'll let him introduce himself and say that, Grant, what would you like to share with us in terms of your story of what a psychometrician is, and also tell us 2 or 3 things that's not in LinkedIn. So,
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Johan. Great to see everyone, and thanks for having me here. What is a psychometrician? A psychometrician is somebody who tries to measure psychological variables. So basically, what I do is I make assessments that attempt to measure things that are important to somebody's psychology. And since I'm an industrial psychologist, those things are usually work related. So anything to do with selection tests, 360 appraisals, personality assessments, and finally my specialty, character assessment. So that is what a psychometrician does. We do a lot of research, we measure things, and we do a lot of statistics. But anyway, so about me, things that Johan asked me to say 3 things that you can't find on LinkedIn. One of the things is I love to be outside, so anything to do with swimming, bike riding, skiing, or whatever. So I love to exercise outside, be out there. I'm a father of 2 beautiful girls and also a husband. And I guess, my favorite ice cream flavor is mint chocolate chip. So all the other psychologists out there can try to analyze that. I know there's a whole sub-universe on people who can analyze people's personality based off of their ice cream choices. So I'm glad to be here talking about workplace virtues. Before I start sharing the screen, I just wanted to get a little background of why I even do workplace virtues. And just to give you a warning, I might slip into different kinds of language because in business, when we're talking about virtues in business, we don't really like to use the word virtues, so we often use the word character as a replacement for virtues. But if you hear me say character and virtues, it's kind of synonymous. And I got into it because I spent many years making assessments, personality assessments. I even did integrity assessments, whether or not a person's going to steal from a company. I did executive assessments, board assessments, worked for big companies like AT&T, Motorola, and I just, I found that there was a sort of a piece of the puzzle that was missing, from the personality assessment, skills assessments, even deep dives into person's backgrounds, resume analysis or whatever. And I came across this idea of virtues actually through my children. And so I saw that using virtues language and virtues development for children was quite effective. And then the school that I sent my young children to at the time, they were like 4, and I went through a virtues project training for myself. And so actually I found the whole thing very beneficial in terms of helping with kids and getting them to exhibit positive behaviors. But I also noticed that they would be very effective for myself. And so I thought maybe this will be a good avenue to approach for business because it's an area that's not really touched and not really addressed very often. And I found that it's a very, very effective way to boost people's not only performance, but also their well-being and their sense of balance and sense of cohesion in life. So I think that is where the link to wellness really comes in, is how you balance things and how you live your life as a cohesive human being. So with that, let me just start sharing my screen. So I'm just going to really approach this in a very simple way to talk about what are workplace virtues, what is character. Oops, let's see here. I'm just trying to figure out how I advance the slides on Zoom here. Okay, so workplace virtues. What are workplace virtues is a question you might ask. Or what are virtues in general, actually? And so there are many, many definitions of virtues out there. They range from the dictionary definitions to very, very wordy, long definitions. But I just wanted to cover the things that you just have this, this space here, and what would be part of this space that is virtues. And the first thing that I'd like to mention is that virtues or character is not just a singular thing. It's a collection of things. It's many things. So there's lots of different bits of character. I'll talk about that in a little bit. And another thing about virtues that separates it from other things is that they always they should at least always manifest themselves in positive behavior. So they're positive characteristics. And they are habits, so we strengthen our virtues by making them into habits. They're universal, so they should be recognized universally from all different cultures. And they're innate. So that means that we all have these virtues or character qualities within us already. They can be latent and need to be developed into a habit, or they're already well developed. So they're innate, universal habits. There's a collection of them, and they're all universally positive in nature. So we're talking about workplace virtues. So let's talk about the model I created for the workplace and virtue. So there's many models out there that you can look up, but this one was specifically validated for the purpose of the workplace. So I aligned this I created this so that it would align well to corporate competency models and other aspects that an HR organization might be using to develop their people. So one dimension is integrity, another is vision, drive, which is your underlying drive to accomplish things, responsibility, getting things done, and influence, which is the interpersonal dimension of this model. And underneath these 5 dimensions, there are 22 virtues. Now, you can go out, you can ask people for a list of virtues, and you can get an almost infinite amount of virtues, number of virtues, hundreds of them. But these 22 are selected because, first of all, there's just no way to create a model that is useful that has more than 22. Because remember, I'm a psychometrician, so I'll get to this later, but I actually created an assessment off this. So you can't have more than this. And then when you go into operational definitions, things start to collapse into each other and combine. And I'll also talk about that a little bit later. But so these are the 22 virtues that are in this character model. Now, what I want to stress is that, how does this play out? So different virtues combine together in order to, exhibit a behavior. So for example, if you're like a high achieving person and you want to achieve, you activate virtues such as purposefulness, your long-term vision, your sense of excellence, persevering, past obstacles, and self-discipline. Now, if you're really, if you're engaging the behavior of analysis, you might be looking at things like reflection and creativity and adherence to rules. If you are really activating this idea of belief, I really believe we can achieve things, you might be activating something like positive spirit, a sense of honor, truthfulness, and respect of others. If you're focusing on innovation, you might be focusing on truthfulness, creativity, purposeful flexibility. If you're managing others, a different set of virtues. And so with the picture I'm trying to show here is that sort of going through life and exhibiting different behaviors and doing different things is sort of like playing the piano keyboard of this model here. So you're activating different things at different times. So if you need to do different things, it's a good idea to have balance throughout this model. So it's good to be able to activate any of these virtues in different situations. If you just focus on one area, or if you don't have any feedback and you're not able to understand what you're really strong at, what you're not strong at, you'll wind up just focusing on certain areas. So what happens if that happens? Okay, if you just focus on one virtue and not others. So I just want to talk about this idea of balance. So let's just zoom into this one virtue here of purposefulness. Now, purposefulness is actually a conglomeration of three different virtues, three different sub-virtues of purposefulness, courage, and confidence, at least the way I define it in the model. Okay, so let's focus in on one of these sub-virtues. I chose this one, courage, because Aristotle liked to talk about courage in defining this idea of the golden mean. Okay, so the golden mean means that, okay, if you're activating a certain virtue, right, if there's too much of it, then that could lead it into like a negative behavior. So for example, too much courage can lead to brash behavior, and too little of it could lead into another negative behavior. In this case, timidity, being too timid. So the virtues language, though, that we're working with is taking a slightly different approach. So the idea of having courage is actually a good thing. You want courage, you want more of it. But what you want to do is you want to be able to balance it against another virtue. So, for example, compassion, reflection, or humility, right? So this way you can have as much courage as you want, but as long as you have another virtue that's sort of counterbalancing that virtue, then everything's good. In fact, better. But where the problems become is when you have an imbalance. And so for example, if you have a real strong sense of courage, but not so much humility, you can imagine that could lead into some kind of selfish behavior. Or if you have too much humility and not enough courage, that could lead into that timidity we talked about, or just not taking enough credit for what you do. So what you want to do is you want to have strength in both virtues and have them balanced. So another concept I want to talk about is this idea of motivation. So how does this play into getting people to do things, doing more of what you're good at or more of what you want to do? So motivation. So there's many different motivation theories, but I like the one that just focuses on two different kinds of needs. And I like to boil it down to this idea of basic needs. Now, basic needs are things like you need money to survive on, you need food, and you need shelter. So if you are in lack of any of these basic needs, these things will motivate you, food, shelter, and money. These things must be satisfied before anything else, any other kinds of needs, right? So if you don't have enough of it, you're going to be very motivated. But the thing is that when we talk about motivation with things like money, for example, which is the typical reinforcer or things that are used in business to motivate people, basically what happens is if somebody reaches a level of cash or income that satisfies their basic needs, offering them more money will not lead to higher performance. And so this is actually a well-known phenomenon in business. It's like you can offer bonuses, you can offer lots of things, but there's a certain limit to how much more performance you're going to get out of it. There's a diminishing return to the point where you don't get any more return by just offering more money. So what is it that really motivates people beyond the basic? And then those are the higher order needs. And so to me, this is where the virtues really come into play, because if you create an environment where people are developing themselves, so you have a higher sense of achievement, right? So you feel like you achieved more, but maybe more importantly, you develop this sense of well-being within your soul. Almost, it's like they're almost spiritual qualities where you feel like you're developing yourself, you're creating more positive interactions with others, and if a company is not just motivated by money, but are motivated by some kind of social good, you feel this sense of belonging and things like that. So I represent that with a heart. And then that leads to the sense of soaring, of flying, flying above yourself into like a sort of almost a transcendent goal. Something that's beyond you, beyond your group, something that you're doing that is universally good throughout. So if you can activate these higher order needs, then actually you can get more out of your employees. So if you're just a company trying to figure out how to get people to do more, you can focus on the higher order needs, the sense of achievement, sense of self-development and connection, and transcendent goals, not just the goals of the organization. So I just wanted to point out that this isn't just a soft kind of idea. We're not just talking about things that are good for people, just like nice things or soft things. There's an organization called Ethisphere that does consulting around ethics. But I'd like to bring this up because they actually have a stock index for companies that they select to be the most ethical. And year over year, they demonstrate that actually companies that are higher in ethics outperform other companies. So their Ethisphere index so far is outperforming the large cap index by 7.1. So actually, if you're a stockbroker and you wanted to beat the S&P 500 or other indexes, a good idea would be to look at companies that develop their employees from a character point of view and have a high ethical standard. So it's not just a soft concept. It's something that we really look at in terms of higher performance. Does anybody have any questions? Not yet? Okay. So
no, I have a question actually,
yeah,
because I was aware
sure.
of that at some point in time, no matter how much money, and I witnessed that many times in the business world, you cannot pay people to buy more time or get them to get the ridiculous deadlines and stuff. That used to be in United States about $80,000. What is that figure right now? Do you know?
Oh, I don't know, but okay. I couldn't tell you what that money. I think that differs, from people and industry. So for example, it has a lot to do with expectations, and also another idea of motivation is the idea of like, okay, so what is the equity between what you're making and your partner's making? Right? So if your partner is somebody who, partner meaning your coworker.
Yeah.
So if your coworker is making more than you doing the same work, you'll be demotivated by that,
Sure.
right? But the thing is, if you go back to that slide, these basic needs are not motivators. They're called demotivators,
Right.
because if you don't get them, you're demotivated. And once you get them, you're no longer motivated. So it's kind of like a carrot and the stick kind of thing. Once you get the carrot, you're not going to chase. You don't have anything else to chase. But if there's no carrot there to get you there, you'll also have no motivation to go forward, right?
Okay.
So they're called demotivators because all they can do is prevent demotivation, but they can't really get you to motivate to work harder or to do more. And it's a well-documented thing. And but yeah, right. So 80 grand for one industry, but I can imagine like people who are in the financial industry might have a higher number than say somebody who's in the nonprofit world.
No, my number was like back in like early 2000. So I haven't followed that since I'm not managing people anymore.
Yeah. I would guess it's pretty much higher than that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
It's like a comment question. So these virtues are kind of innate within us, and they are developed over time. And depending on if we want them to be one of our virtues. But so in business, how would you encourage, if you wanted to use that as a motivator to help people to, discover these qualities as part of a business, how would you motivate people in a business sense to want to balance out their different virtues and encourage them to discover virtues?
That's a really good question, because how do you get people to be motivated by these motivators, right? You almost can't tell them that that's what you're doing, because if you tell them, oh, here's your reward for working for this company, we're going to develop your virtues. Right. They're not going to be motivated by that. They'll be like, well, I want money, But right. At the same time, if you put people in a group, I've done this many times, and you just ask them, okay, think of people who you admire. And it doesn't even have to be a real person. It could be a fictional person. It could be a living person, somebody you know, somebody you don't, somebody's dead. It doesn't matter. Just think about somebody who you admire, and they'll ask them to write three things down, and you get a whole bunch of people in a room, and you may write 50 things. And they'll all be things that are like they persevered, or they were loving, or they were courageous, right? So they would have all those kinds of words. Every single one of them would be some take on a virtue, all of them. Mm-hmm. And what is never written down, ever, and I've done this many times, they'll never say things like they were rich, they were powerful, or they were famous, right? And so if you tell people, hey, I'll make you rich, they might be, hey, that sounds like a great idea. If you say, hey, I'm going to make you virtuous, what are you talking about, right? And so it's a hard thing to do. So it's really about creating the culture. It's not just about telling people, it's about creating a culture that develops these virtues so that that they're getting this nourishment without you're telling them, here's your nourishment. They're getting the nourishment. And what happens is when they're in that culture, and one example of an organization that it was a financial organization, so all they did was make money. It was founded by former members of Enron who
Oh, great.
who got out of the ship because they were like, this is terrible. We got to get out of here. So they created another, like investment company, and they did something where they took 50% of their profits and then chopped that up, and so they gave a portion of that to the employees, and they said to the employees that, okay, you take this money and you do something related to service with it. It has to be a service thing, right? So they have to go out and be a service. And it's up to them how they do it. It could be a donation, or it could be actually, I'm going to do this project. And then they took another big chunk of that, and then they donated it to a cause that was chosen by the organization, by people in the organization. So it was like a demographic thing. So this is a company that has no moral purpose, right? There's no purpose other than making money. So they had to find another way to get people to have that transcendent goal, and it had to do with hunting down this terrible warlord in Nigeria or something, Joseph Kony. And they did all these amazing things. They created these with this money. They created radio antennas so that they can call, for help when they see the guerrillas coming. And the person the CFO of the organization was going into the jungles of Africa to build these things, places where like Delta Force, from the army wouldn't go. But the moral of the story is that this was one of the most highest performing, organizations you can ask for. Mm-hmm. And once you have this atmosphere, you will not have turnover, because there's no way people can leave this environment to go to another similar environment that doesn't have this nourishment. Mm-hmm. That's cool. So that's it. So you get better performance, but also you get this loyalty. And really, when you think about it, if you're in a beautiful city that is, environmentally healthy, right, has good food available, I mean, would you want to, move to a polluted city, right? It's a kind of same thing where if you really care about yourself, your whole health, your whole, being, right? You're not going to want to leave an organization that supports you in that way. Even if you make a little bit less money than you could if you could move somewhere else.
You actually, Grant, touched on two really good bases, because that's how we used to do back in 90s and 2000. We used 360 to point out some of the virtues that we want in our employees to be developed. And during the performance review, we would create the plan how they can develop some of these. And then we, as an organization, used to measure how we are ethical and everything else by the turnover. How many people and engineers are known as a high-paying gypsies, so they will go in the heartbeat to the different organization if there is not something that satisfies their higher needs. So the turnover was a good measurement for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you have high turnover, you can almost bet that is your problem.
Yeah,
in your organization.
Yeah,
and it's a shame that companies give up on this concept very easily, because it's very hard. I mean, as Chris was saying, it's hard to associate this with any kind of success, right? And so it's hard to say, hey, this is what we're going to do in order to achieve. A lot of people will give up on that concept because they just think it's too soft, right? And so what happens is they create these models that they say, they pay lip service to this idea of like integrity and things like that, but they don't actually do anything about it. And so an example was, I worked for an organization. This happened several times, actually. I was as a consultant with creating different models with different organizations, not related to character. And so if you go back to that model, I'll just backtrack here. See if I can do this. without making you dizzy. Okay, so just going to here. Okay, so there's always an agreement on vision. Creating this high level of vision and drive. Responsibility and influence. And so you'll get all kinds of skills. So if you're developing a 360, you'll get all kinds of sub skills within these dimensions that you can measure, and you can ask people and you can get feedback. And then when it comes to integrity, oftentimes there's like, oh, of course we've got integrity. You don't have to measure that. So they ignore it, and it's a huge blind spot that comes back and bites them in the end. Because what happens is all the good people leave. Mm-hmm. They go somewhere else.
Right.
And your organization gets more and more toxic, and like huge organizations can go out of business if you forget that piece. So an example was where I worked with Motorola, who they didn't go out of business, but they substantially declined because they changed their culture from a family-oriented model to something. They try to duplicate GE's model, and all the good people left, and the organization suffered. Okay, so that's a great discussion. Any other comments?
Grant,
questions?
Yeah, two observation comments. One is to your point about this notion for transcendence. Because of the recent 20th anniversary of 9/11, some of you may have heard there was a major Wall Street firm in the towers that lost like 2/3 of their employees. And so they had to decide to either go bankrupt or recreate themselves. So they decided to recreate themselves. And they had always been based on family, or they would only want to work with people that they would want to be friends with outside of work. So that was the culture they created. And so when they lost all the employees and all the primary breadwinners, if you will, they decided to recreate the firm to continue honors. And one of the requirements is that every new hire, they would say, we're going to pay you X dollars, but guess what? And this is a great, if you think of this as a reverse recruitment tool, that 25% of your paycheck will be withheld and go into a fund, and that fund will be used to support all the families of all the employees that passed away. So think of that as a recruiting tool. You say, we're going to pay you X dollars as your salary, and we're going to deduct right on the top 25% of that. And so the people that they attracted were clearly people who were motivated not just by money, and these are new recruits. And so that's just sort of an interesting story about Wall Street and money and what you were talking about with the Enron. The other, so it's just, I thought I'd share that. But the other thing that's more important is that in Bauman Wellness and in our theory of change, we talk about sort of the ABC of affect, behaviors, and emotions. And affect being about really addressing the person's feelings, emotions, and where they're at. And so it seems to me, or I'd like you to comment of that, when we think of affect and emotions and feelings, how does that tie into the characters and virtues? And I can see how it can tie into higher needs, because you're appealing to a person's higher needs through their emotions to belong to something bigger than that. But how do you then tie in that desire, those feelings and emotions, into virtues? What has been some of your observation or experience, the relationship between emotions, feelings, and then virtues and characters?
And just to tie to that question, the current state of big corporation, at least in Silicon Valley, is where I have my son's friend who works for one of the big corporations down in the valley, and he broke up with his girlfriend, was heartbroken, and during the conversation with his boss, he broke into the tears. This is 30-year-old male. And then called my son and says, oh my God, I cry in front of my boss. They're going to lay me off. I am scared to death. That is a still atmosphere, at least in the valley. So can you just explore on that a little bit? Because it's the same question, just a little bit extended.
Yeah. So the idea. So the question is, how does affect relate to virtues and also health and wellness and stress and everything else. And so it does. And in fact, actually, affect has a direct link to certain virtues. So I would say that reflection, moderation is one of them, but also positive spirit is directly related to this idea of affect. So are you feeling good, right? Or are you feeling happy, or in that regard? Other researchers like Seligman and his colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania talk about optimism a lot. And Angela Duckworth wrote a book about grit, which has a lot to do with determination combined with hope and optimism. And so these things do have a significant relationship with affect. And affect, in turn, also has a lot of relationships with positive outcomes, such as, even like overcoming injury, so like rehabilitation, surviving cancer. It's been shown that people who have a higher sense of hope or optimism can actually survive cancer at a higher rate than those who don't have this idea of hope and optimism. And so it's kind of important in order to have this idea of a positive affect in order to develop the other virtues. Now, so this idea of balance, so it can also backfire on you, though. So if you only focus on affect, like feeling good, like being optimistic and hope, but you don't address the other virtues, such as orderly, just getting things done or being organized or having a sense of purpose or whatever, then you'll fall into an imbalance again. So it's just like any other virtue, but it's a critical one. This idea of hope, positive spirits, reflection, moderation, things like that, are critical in order for your health. Because if you're stressed out over and unhappy and have no hope that things will turn better, you won't be motivated to do anything about it. So one example is that there's this quarterback of the Washington Redskins. He was actually for many teams that know Alex Smith. He destroyed his leg. This guy was a journeyman quarterback, and his career was basically over because he destroyed his leg in the tackle. But he was absolutely determined to come back. And the doctor, and he went to, instead of just going to a regular rehab, he went to a veterans hospital, which focuses on not decapitation, but lost limbs and things like that, really horrible injuries. And the doctors there said that you could tell by the look in their eye whether or not they will overcome this injury or not, because it's that determination, that hope and optimism. So so affect is incredibly important. It's sort of like a precursor in order to move forward. And so that kind of segues into what I was going to talk about next with this idea. It's like, okay, so what if you find out that you're in a hole, and you don't know what to do, right? And you're in this hole, you don't know what to do, and your affect has been destroyed or hindered because you're in this situation where you feel like you're just not, your virtues and your character qualities aren't strong enough to do the things you need to do. So how do you get out of it? So one thing in order to do that, to help you, is to determine what your strengths are, because we all have strengths. So let's just say your positive spirit isn't the highest, but you can look at something else that you might be good at. Maybe you're super organized and orderly, so you can see how maybe your organization skills might improve your positive outcome, your positivity. And so you do that by saying, oh, how does positivity increase my orderliness? How does that enhance my strength? So to use the strength as a lever point or a ladder to help you overcome it. And another ladder is this idea of accompaniment. So we shouldn't look at this as a journey by ourselves, but as something that we do together. So if you look at the purpose of life is to really grow and develop yourself into the best person as you can. Another purpose would be to form positive connections with other people. And so, how do we accompany ourselves, each other, in order to develop each other in a way, and so that develops our virtues? And so that is what's critical in business, is to create that culture where people feel the free to leverage their strengths and to accompany each other to overcome any kind of deficiencies that they might have. Am I getting close to what you were talking about, Johan?
Yeah, and actually, the one question I want to ask is, I'm sure there are many definitions of affect. And it seems like you were, again, I'm not saying it's necessarily a good or bad definition, but you're focusing on a very specific qualities of hope, positiveness, and that to do that. And my understanding, affect is also can be just something in the general range of our feelings and our emotions in a broader sense of the word. And so the reason I say that is because, again, in our theory of change, we see that we want to meet the person where they're at in terms of what their broad range of feelings and emotions. And it's and then we even talked about trauma, and I've talked about trauma. And so again, it's this, how do we engage with the person where they're at? And I think what you're getting at with this leveraging strength and coming in really builds on that. So I'd love to maybe hear examples of a specific example in terms of maybe wellness in the workplace or individuals, trying to overcome adversity, or even, and I know I know you're not a trauma specialist, but in the workplace, I mean, even watching the evening news can cause trauma. So trauma is not just childhood trauma. It could be climate. It could be what's going on, race, all that. So it'd be interesting for you just to expand a little more on the broader definition of affect and character, and how do we work within those two areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, let me. So again, as you were saying, it's not just those certain virtues that I was pointing out, with positive affect. It's just that those were the ones that seem to gather the most research, to determine how they affect these positive outcomes. Whether overcoming trauma, physical trauma, disease, or whatever. But as you say, it is a broad spectrum. And actually, I was going to go on to say, and I'm glad you brought it up, because if you just focus on those specific virtues, that can lead to an imbalance in itself, right? Only the ones that lead to a positive affect or a positive feeling. But there's a broad range of emotions, a broad range of things. And so you have to address this model in a holistic point of view, from a holistic manner. And so if you remember the slide I was just showing, and it's like playing the piano. You have to be able to be able to press all the different keys, and if any of those keys are out of tune, it's not going to sound right, right? So it's the same thing here. If any of the keys are out of tune, then either one thing it's not going to come off right. You're going to have a certain behavioral problem that might be related to that, or you're going to be a one-trick pony and can only do certain things. You can only play, the super, hard stuff, or the super soft music. You're not going to be able to play all the different tunes all in between, right? So, but how do you do that? And this isn't a plug or anything, but but how do you do that? How do you tune yourself, and how do you figure out ways to what are your strengths, and what are your development areas? And so that's where my expertise as psychometrician comes in. Is you can measure these things. This is kind of blurry, but it doesn't really matter. It's just an example. You can get sort of feedback on this from an assessment point of view. But you can also, going back to this accompaniment idea, is to have a coach or somebody who you trust to talk about these things. And so they can give you feedback in terms of character. So, but the conversation, if you're just talking to your friend, those conversations can go in all different directions, right? And so you don't know if that's going to be developmental or not. So it's really important to really focus on this idea of character and have a character-based discussion. So the problem with that is that these are sort of hidden characteristics. They're not things that people think about day to day. And so that's why it's useful to really focus on the language of the virtues. Some of the things that Suzanne, I'm sure, talked about. Talking about using the language of virtues, setting boundaries, and honoring people who demonstrate virtues, and having this idea of spiritual accompaniment.
So, Grant. Yeah, one thing you and I have talked about, and I think it's important to emphasize, like there's some assessments or some people just focus on strengths. And I think the beauty of what you do is maybe speak to that. Really, it's about how do you also develop the areas, and what's the challenge is if all you do is just focus on strengths, what's the deficit in that versus what you try and focus on. And also, I don't know if it's easy for you, but the bar chart on the bottom, is there a slide that just expands it out so people can see that? Because I think that's at all the three charts, that's the one that people can get.
Yeah, I didn't put it into the slideshow, but sorry. But I didn't want to stress the assessment so much, but basically you can see there's a bar chart, right? So those bar charts are just giving scores for these things, on this periodic table. So you can just imagine, a bar chart giving you scores on each one of these things. And I'm glad you brought that idea of strengths up, because yes, strengths are important to know what you are strong on. It's also important to honor those strengths and to continue to develop those. But there is a movement out there that occurred, was very popular. I'm not going to name it, but it says, okay, go find your strengths and then forget your weaknesses and just focus on your strengths. And it went along with this idea of authenticity, right? Okay, this is who I am, so I'm just going to be who I am, right? And people really gravitated to that as a positive thing. Because it makes you feel good if you're just, okay, this is what I'm strong on. I don't have to worry about my development needs. I'm just going to be good at what I do. But what happens is, and I keep talking about this idea of balance. If you focus on your strengths and not on your development areas or other things, the holistic point of view, then you will only be able to the imbalances will become more and more exacerbated. So any kind of negative aspect of your strength that were popping up will become worse. So I didn't want to go into too much research here, either on performance or anything, but the HR, the industrial organizational psychologists have investigated this for decades, because this is a big part of what IO psychologists do, is really focus on development areas and helping people to develop them. And there's decades of research that shows that's a positive thing to do, to help people become better at their jobs or their life or whatever. So there's decades of research that says you shouldn't ignore your weaknesses or development areas. Not to say you shouldn't focus on your strength, but you shouldn't ignore everything else. And so, just getting into this music, so if you can only play, three chords, you can't play a whole lot of music, right? You can play, well, they say you can play almost any music, any pop song with 3 chords or 4 chords, but you can't, your repertoire would be significantly diminished if you can only do that. So you want to be able to do many things, and the situations call for different things, different behaviors, and so you don't want to be, around with one hand and one leg tied behind your back. You want to be able to adapt and adjust to any situation. And so this ethosphere chart I showed. There's also, resiliency is an important part of organizations, and there's research out there that shows that organizations bounce back. So, for example, let's see, I got my face on. So you can see this huge dip. That was the pandemic, but there was also back in 2008, I think, right? There was a big financial downturn. Those organizations that had a higher ethical point of view or were identified as higher ethical organizations bounced back from adversity much faster or more effectively than other organizations. So organizations that have a strong sense of cohesion will be more resilient to challenges.
Ed had a question in the box chat, and he said, development needs is a great term. How do we address that? Ed, do you want to expand on that question and in the context of meeting with practitioners, facilitators, and training or clients? Can you expand on that?
Well, I'm largely a nutritionist and integrative health advisor, right? So I see deficiencies and toxicities, deficiency, excess, and toxicities. And I think we can use that sort of idea across behaviors and across attitude. And so clearly, people have some deficiencies in many of these virtues, and all these virtues are good. So showing them to people and going, here's really the RDA, the recommended daily intake of virtue, I think would be really cool. And then, oh, gee, you're so truthful, you're obnoxious, you're just over the top in terms of your candid thing, et cetera, and so forth. And then, even a strength can become toxic if it's overdone. So I think in terms of bringing this to a group attention, to a company attention, and even to a personal attention, and this idea of we're developing people, all of us are a work in progress. All of us are looking for things. And then the culture, which people always talk about, is just such a conflict-driven culture. And this wellness notion is really about collaboration and about respect and about diversity and about, recognizing the intrinsic goodness that people have that has been sort of pushed out for, survival needs and other kinds of things. But I do wonder, I like the term, there's developmental needs. That is not a judgment. It's just, I never got it. I never developed it. It's untapped, it's unmanifested, and how we might start to teach around that, because our whole model is about teaching and about accompaniment.
Oh, no, I was just going to agree. So it can be related to deficiencies, right? But the toxicity really does come out when it's in balance with another virtue. So actually, the toxicity can manifest itself in the form of the strength, not in the development area, because your strength can be your greatest weakness if it's not balanced out by other virtues.
One is, it seems to me like it has to, if you're going to create a culture, it has to start with management. And management has to, first of all, praise people's praiseworthy qualities and then first, and then bring up like, wow, you are a strong cup of coffee kind of thing. But there's another couple of elements in here that influences all of this, which are difficult. And so Arima brought up a point where here's a young man and he's crying, and he says, well, I'm going to get fired for that. Well, what is crying in a in a corporate setting? That's a weakness, and it's a female weakness. So you've got these, and this is really like bothers me. You've got these biases and these prejudices towards women and towards people of color, and they inform not just the work environment, but how assessment is done on a broad scale. Where does success come from? Where does failure come from? Oh, it's these qualities here. It's these qualities here. And then, and oftentimes women keep trying to improve themselves. They keep trying to improve themselves. They improve themselves more. They dress more. They become more this, more that, more that. They still freaking get paid less. They still freaking have less rights. They still are not being included at the top. So, all of this is good, but those things have to change too, because otherwise you can improve yourself until the cows come home. But if you have prejudice against you in the workplace that is infused into it, then you're not going to go anywhere. And the work culture is not going to value you. And that's the other thing. You're not going to be valued.
To piggyback off of that as well, I have to share from personal experience when I've had unpleasant working relationships with management or leadership, it's been with women, ironically. And I think that, to Chris's point, I think something that we see in the workplace is that because there is prejudice against women, or there's this view that they have to live up to a man's expectation or push their way in to prove that they're worthy as the men. It's like I see sometimes women overcompensate by almost pushing their weight around, and then they end up, it perpetuates this idea that they're not fit, because then they end up, I don't know how, and I'm saying this very well, but I think that women are kind of in this darned if you do, darned if you don't situation, that if they're too aggressive, too assertive, and push their weight around too much, then they're viewed as being, right, unpleasant to work with. But then if they don't do that, then they're not as aggressive or assertive as men, and they're not proving themselves. So women are just kind of darned if they do, darned if they don't, and it's really frustrating. And then when you're somebody who's reporting to a manager and you feel like you can't build a strong working relationship with a leader that is treating you with respect and that you can have a strong working relationship with, that's hard as an employee. And Grant, to your point, the job I've had, I can't even tell you how many jobs I've had in my 25, 30 years of adulthood. And the job that paid me the highest salary that I've ever made in my life, I quit because I couldn't stand the person I was working for.
Yeah, I mean, you can because it's toxic, so no matter how much money you get, toxicity like that is not worth it, right? And so you guys are hitting so many nails on the head here with this. Oh, and the women in the workplace issue is a huge one, and it's so illustrative because actually I've done some research on this. I don't have a slide on it, unfortunately, but the differences between men and women on these virtues, and you'll see that there are some differences from one virtue to the next, that maybe the men are higher and the women are higher or whatever. On balance, women outperform men on the virtues, and this is a very toxic thing. It's part of our culture, and it's something that needs to be addressed, because there is research out there. There was one study, and I can't remember the researchers, I'm sorry, but just comes to mind, where they actually analyzed, people who were being hired for a job. Okay, so they asked structured interview questions And then they get these responses. So those people who responded mostly in the areas of virtues, I'm sorry, I'm going to stay here because that are around responsibility, getting things done, overcoming obstacles, having a high sense of, vision and purpose. They were considered hireable. Now, those are sort of the ones that are determined to be sort of more masculine areas. Sorry, I keep clicking the wrong thing. But those people who tended to respond in areas such as like compassion, friendliness, unity, and trust were things that are more deemed feminine virtues, were considered they were not just hired, but they were considered unhireable. You could not hire these people. And so it's a huge catch-22, not just to say that women, exhibit these virtues and men only exhibit these. We exhibit all of them, and it's a bad thing, not just for the women, because they're in the catch-22. They're expected to be feminine, but they can't achieve being feminine. They have to be aggressive, but if they're aggressive, then they're not feminine, right? So that's a problem. But also men. So just what Chris said, a guy cried at work and now I'm going to get fired. That's also oppressive, right? So men can also not exhibit their full range of virtue. So it's a very toxic thing. It's part of the general culture of the United States. I wouldn't say that it's a global thing. It gets even worse in some countries. I think South Korea has this even higher degree of problem, and some other cultures might be better, but it's something that we can't really address unless we look at the full range. We really understand what we're talking about when we're talking about virtue and success, and looking at the full range. And it starts, as Chris was saying, with management. The problem there is that management aren't balanced themselves, so it's a hard nut to crack. It's a hard thing to get started. It really needs to have this volition from the management themselves, and they have to believe in this stuff in order to really drive it through the organization.
And Grant, I have a question just about the virtues that you have displayed on the screen right now as they're displayed. And as I'm looking at it and going through them in my mind, my inner being, it just doesn't matter for some of them. I don't care if I have them or not. You know what I mean? Which means that's the area of development, probably potential. But the way how person see itself, some of these may not matter to them.
Right. If they took an assessment, it would come out. But so then, as a coach in this area, I would tell the story. So I would I would look at their graph in the bottom of the page here, and I would start telling them what kind of behaviors that leads to. Mm-hmm. And it leads and I will start with the strength and work my way down. And once you get down there, some negative things come out. And I can guarantee you, every single time people, when they see a deficiency, they might say, I don't care about that, or they say, I disagree, I'm not low on that, and then they find out they are actually low on that. They want to develop it. Mm-hmm. Because once you start pulling, one thing about virtues that's very different than skills or even personality, once you start tugging on that string, there's a direct connection to your, I don't want to say behavior, soul or heart or whatever. You feel it and you want to exhibit that virtue. And that's the beauty of it. That's why it works so well with children, because if you once they learn the language and you start pulling on those heartstrings, they have no choice but to exhibit the virtue. Now, adults are a little bit more jaded, a little bit more, we have more scar tissue over things. So it's a little harder to pull, but, we still want to develop it. And so oftentimes people look at moderation, for example, as something as deficient to success. Actually, people with low moderation earn more money. But when they see it, and you can almost tell the emotion behind their eyes that they want to develop that virtue in a better way, because it leads to problems in your life. So, so whatever it is, you might say, oh, I don't care about this virtue, or, whatever, I'm not, it's not important to me. It actually might not be important, which is fine, and so it might not be something you want to focus on, but you find people who have deficiencies that they want to develop, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And they'll change from person to person.
Grant, this is so powerful.
It is.
And I wanted to just highlight, Christina's actually has two more seminars, one on social emotional learning, and the other is on what's that movie, the Pixar, Inside Out. And then Christina has her own program called Character Lights in Action. And I'd just be interested, Christina, in any of your observation and comments. And I know it's sort of preaching to the converted here, because you really understand that. But in terms of what Grant has shared, and when you think of wellness, character lights action, social learning, is there any sort of insight or any sort of aha or anything that you've heard that is helping you synthesize a lot of the work that you've done? Is there anything that resonates with you?
Well, I mean, I think the main connection that I'm making is that the work I do, it's Lights Character Action, is an after-school program that I ran for about 6 years. And the kind of foundation of that was working with elementary and middle schoolers. The focus with elementary students was on character virtues, and the focus for middle schoolers was on leadership development. And it was really using film as a way to show examples from film of people modeling character virtues or not, or people modeling leadership values or not, and engaging the students in a conversation around, okay, based on the character choice that this character made in the film, what was the end result? And was that a good choice? If they could go back and do it again, what different choice might they have made instead? And how might the trajectory of the whole story been totally different had this character made a different choice? And I think what I'm recognizing is that by trying to set that foundation in young ones at an early age, that by the time they get to the working world, hopefully they will have cultivated a lot of this understanding of the value and importance of character and leadership virtues, because they will be the future leaders of the world. They will be the ones that are running the corporations or running the countries, or, they're the ones that are going to be calling the shots. And so if we instill character values and leadership development at an early age, then hopefully we're kind of setting them on that right track right from the beginning. Because if they can be the ones that become the future leaders that already have it ingrained, and then they create a culture in their organization that is filled with character values and leadership, then that company is going to thrive. And I think, to Grant's point, that we're seeing a lot of companies kind of struggle right now because they don't have that as their culture and foundation.
Thank you.
Yeah, the art is a very powerful way to access this, because there's so many. It frees you from just being yourself, right? And so you can take on different characters, or you can express yourself in different ways. There's another organization, I think, in Brooklyn that does a similar thing, with acting, with stage performances. It's just amazing, how it works. And you're absolutely right. The younger you can get people to address these issues, these character qualities, to develop them, the better, because they're the future. But that's also in their nascent developmental stage. And if you can get this as part of their learning early on, then that's really great. Most character-based organizations are actually education-oriented organizations. They focus on young kids. But it can work with adults too. And I've seen some of the most effective character development programs that I've been involved in has to do with some kind of drama. Whether it's a role play or some kind of artistic expression, in a workshop. Or I was involved in one organization that did training for board members. And what they did is they brought in actors, and they acted out as different, kinds of board members. And then it was their job to sort of figure out what character deficiencies these board members had and what they can do better, and how can they develop those deficiencies in order to be a better board member. So it's, the arts is a very powerful way to access these things because it frees you of your shell. I mean, for many reasons, but, frees you of yourself really, and you can really explore in different ways. So
maybe
acting.
You can share a little bit, just to segue towards the end, is that gamification and what nascent efforts we're trying to do with the gamification and the Character Yak game. Maybe just touch a little bit about that, because gamification is also another way of engaging people, and as you said, with role playing or acting,
or not just the gamification. I will say storytelling, and then people from the story pick up the character and they have to explain why they like that one or don't like that one. How that is the whole thing. Storytelling or gamification, I think it's the same thing in my mind, at least.
Yeah. Just gonna stop sharing. We can start it again if we need it. So yeah, absolutely. So these are different ways to access it. It's one of the hardest aspects of talking about character is the fact that it's a difficult topic to approach, right? And so things like arts or storytelling, I would think, is kind of like an artistic way of addressing it. And as Johan was saying, gamification, get people to engage in a fun way on these character qualities. And so we've actually created card games, and it'd be great to create a computer game, same thing, or a dating app or whatever. But it's to find ways to engage people in a sort of a non-direct way, that in a way they're addressing their character issues, but their character qualities, talking about it, but they don't know, or they're having fun doing it. So it's a tricky topic to discuss. That's one of the biggest challenges of character, is the fact that it's sensitive, and it's sort of almost like a taboo topic to talk about. Ooh, are you talking about my character? That kind of thing. But it's so powerful, and it's not a taboo thing. It's something that you can engage very easily once you get below the surface. Once you get beyond that reluctance, because actually it's actually a very powerful thing to talk about, and it's also very fulfilling, right? And so people want to engage in it. It's very approachable. And another thing I would say in that Venn diagram that I showed at the very beginning, an aspect of character or virtues is we not only are they innate, but we can all develop them. It's something we can all develop, so it's not like math. Some people can be great at math. Some people, are terrible at math. It doesn't matter. But for virtues, we have them and we can all develop them. So it's something that we can make a movement on. And as a psychometrician, that's something that I am very intrigued with, because if you can find something that you can actually develop quite easily without having to go to school, without having to learn anything, you just focus on the virtue itself, then that's a very intriguing concept.
One more tricky question for you. So let's say you do analysis with the character of the organization, of each employee. Can you, based on that, give the character of the company? Yes, of course. Oh, that's a beautiful thing. Then,
so that's what it's an aggregate analysis, right? And so you have, if you get enough people, you can say, okay, you guys are really good at purposeful. You're good at planning, but you're not so good at this organization thing, right? or you're not good at compassion, or you're not good at listening to people. Also, you can also determine whether or not there's diversity within the group on their virtues. So if you find that say a leadership team have all similar virtues, and they're really strong at certain things, but they're not strong at others, then you can see that there's a blind spot within the team, right? And so you can say, okay, this is an area that you are not, as a group, good at, and so you have to think about this. And so oftentimes, I had an organization that I was working with their board, and they were all the same. And I was like, listen, you guys are in a bubble here, and if you look at the rest of your organization, they might not be hearing the same things that you're an echo chamber, and they're not hearing what you're hearing in your echo chamber. And so you have to, so you can determine, you can help people find out whether or not they are within this bubble, and whether or not they need to sort of break out of that bubble and be able to see the rest of the landscape that might be available to them.
Great.
To that point, Rima, you may have remembered.
Yeah, I do.
When we first started this journey with the board, we had all the board members take the CFA, and so we can look at an aggregate, but it's clearly that a lot has happened since, a year and a half ago.
Uh-huh.
And so one of the things I would invite the people on this call and the board of Bauman and some of the more active facilitators is to really think about how to invite Grant to do a workshop, but before our next circle in winter time, so whether it's in October or November. And the workshop has many, many benefits. So it could be for a facilitator in training as they're developing their practice, how to help with their own personal growth and development as being a practitioner, but also with their clients. Because again, when they engage with their clients maybe, they have the tools as a health practitioner, as a nutritionist, as culinary food, but then getting into their virtues or characters and helping that, I think, will be of value to that practitioner. And then also to some of our members who are consumers or looking to develop their own path of wellness, being aware of their own strengths and development areas can help that, and also in the workplace. So I would encourage all of us to have a conversation and maybe invite Grant to do a workshop and to target 2 of these 3 things, because I think, again, it's part of this bigger picture of wellness, and from these different lenses, and the word that I always end up landing on is wholeness, because we're all parts of the whole, and we can also look at that whole through many different lenses of virtues, of health, nutrition, and things like that. So really, Grant, thanks very much. Are there any other comments, observations, or just sort of epiphanies that anyone had that they'd like to share before we thank Grant? Anything?
I just want to appreciate Johan, because Johan, brought this forward or brought this to us. And Johan made us do this in the beginning.
Yeah, you did.
He made us do character yak. He made us sit through his kind of, profiling and whatnot. And we did. Yeah. And we processed, and we went through a very deliberate kind of, who are we? How are we? What do we want to do? How do we want to do it? And, it was fine, but a little tedious. But now I understand it more. I mean, I certainly appreciate the why, and I want to learn a little more about the how we implement this. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And how it becomes relevant and so forth. But meeting you and just appreciating your candor and your your sensibility is really cool. So we'll be back in touch. Thanks so much.
Okay. Well, thanks, Ed. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure having this discussion with you all.